Welcome back to Family Foundations for Optimal Sexual Development. This is session 9, and in this session, we're going to compare the approaches to sex education. We'll do a quick overview or an introduction. We'll talk about the history of sex education and how did we get to where we are, and what are the current strategies for guiding youth. Well, there are two broad approaches. One is called comprehensive sex education. It is the dominant culture strategy. It's being driven by Planned Parenthood, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. And in Canada, it's being driven by SECAN, which is the Sexual Information Education Council of Canada, and in the United States, SECUS, which is the Sexual and Information Education Council of the United States. The second approach is called sexual risk avoidance or optimal sexual health. It is based upon the public health primary prevention strategy. And this approach is being researched and driven by organizations like Ascend, the Institute for Research and Evaluation, the Institute for Women's Health, and many curriculum providers and policy organizations. Let's compare the premises for comprehensive sex ed and sexual risk avoidance. The premise for comprehensive sex ed is people are sexual from birth. We have sexual right to engage sexually as long as we do it safely and consensually at any age. Many youth are sexually active, so youth need the knowledge and skills to reduce risks and have satisfying sexual relations. The sexual health or the sexual risk avoidance approach says this: youth sex has risks. Most youth are not sexually active, and the majority of sexually experienced youth do regret. So the goal should be to provide youth with the knowledge and skills to protect their future by avoiding the risks of non-marital sex. The sexual risk avoidance model is based upon the optimal health model. And this model is a balance of physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and intellectual health. And the goal is that youth who are not engaging in at-risk activity, we want to keep them there. We want to provide them with the knowledge and skills so that they will stay in the center of the target, not engaging in risk. And those youth who may be engaging in risky activities, our goal is to draw them towards the no risk. Often when we talk about sex education, we refer to the term abstinence, for no risk. And sometimes people say, abstinence, oh, that's all based on religion. Well, let's look at the history of sex education and get an idea of how we got to where we are today. Back in the early 1900s, our government had a problem. We had rampant syphilis and gonorrhea. There was no cure. The government was trying to develop a solution, and their only option was to encourage abstinence, develop abstinence policies. They encouraged this in education, and they encouraged kids to wait until marriage. So it was a family-focused approach, not based on religion, but a policy based on health. What is the healthiest thing to do? But then in the 1930s to the 50s, the foundation for comprehensive sex education actually started to form. And it was based on the research work of Alfred Kinsey and the work of Hugh Hefner and Playboy magazine and Planned Parenthood. Let's look at this time in history. Alfred Kinsey lived in the United States between 1894 and 1956. He was credited as the father of the sexual revolution. He was a University of Indiana researcher. He published 2 reports. The first one is The Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, 1948, and then The Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953. A little background on Kinsey. Kinsey was bisexual as a young man. When he married, he and his wife agreed to have sexual relations with others. And he had a PhD in biology from Harvard, and he was a very successful had a very successful academic career as an entomologist, an insect scientist. Well, how did he get from insect scientist to sexologist? Well, when he was lecturing in 1935, he was talking about the sex life of bugs and insects. And he just made a critical statement about the ignorance of the human sexual understanding. And he said, in his view, delayed sexual activity for humans was psychologically harmful. Well, the Rockefeller Foundation picked up on this, and they provided him with some funding to do some research. His research took place between 1939 and 48, and the focus was on interviewing people to find out about their sexual experiences, to basically develop a baseline of understanding. Unfortunately, at this time, it was during World War II, and where were the men? They were overseas, and the women were in the factories building the armaments. He could not find clients from the general population to survey. So he went to the prisons, the prostitutes on the streets, and homosexuals and pedophiles that provided him with information, and did his surveys. When it came to investigating the sexual interests of children, he took the research work, at least they called it research work, and the experiences from pedophiles who engaged with children. In one of his books, Table 34 lists the abuse of 317 infants, toddlers, and children who were sexually abused by pedophiles to induce orgasms, and they timed how many orgasms could happen in a period of time. Kinsey claimed that the scientific research was sent to him by multiple pedophiles, and he also claimed in his book that although children were screaming and crying and striking their abusers, they definitely derived pleasure. I guess we need to question that, and many people did. The conclusion from that, however, from his research, was that the human purpose is sexual fulfillment. Humans are naturally bisexual. 10% of humans are homosexual. He said religious prejudices forced people into chastity, heterosexuality, and monogamy, and that the repressing of sexual interest is psychologically harmful. And he said when it came to children, children are sexual from birth, and they benefit from adult-child sexual experiences, and they are not psychologically harmed by engaging in sex. There were many critics of his work. They criticized him for being biased because he was driven by his own personal sexual interests. They criticized his methodology because the data was skewed by overrepresentation of prisoners, sex workers, homosexuals, and pedophiles. And they criticized his work for being illegal because of the collection of data from pedophiles without reporting the abusers to police. That said, he still published the books, and his research was accepted by many. And as I said, Alfred Kinsey, he stated the human purpose is sexual fulfillment. This research was picked up by Planned Parenthood, who used it to secure funds to expand. And at this time, Hugh Hefner, the author of Playboy magazine, or the founder of Playboy magazine, said, "I am now going to be the pamphleteer of sexual liberation." He wanted to expand Kinsey's message. So let's go back to the timeline. So we hit now the 1960s and 70s with the sexual revolution. At this time, I said Planned Parenthood was expanding, and their goal is to be ready as educators to help young people to obtain sex before marriage. That was their stated goal. So, with this goal in mind, Planned Parenthood worked with Playboy magazine to create the Sexual Information and Education Council of Canada and the US. In 1964, these organizations were founded to influence sexual health education here in Canada and the United States. So let's now move to the 1990s, the AIDS era. At this time, we had the AIDS problem. We had high teen pregnancy rates, and we had an increase in other sexually transmitted infections. The government is saying, what are we going to do? Well, Seek Us and CCAN, through Planned Parenthood and the United Nations and the World Health Organization, went to both governments and said, we've got an answer. Comprehensive sex education. Let's provide our youth with condoms, and let's teach about sexual rights, and we will reduce the STI rates. We will help to protect our kids from getting HIV. So our governments embraced this, and comprehensive sex education became the dominant approach in our schools. Let's look at, in detail, what comprehensive sex ed is. The definition of comprehensive sex ed is a sexual rights approach that equips young people with the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and values that they need to determine and to enjoy their sexuality, both physically and emotionally, and individually and in relationships. Comprehensive sex education focuses on sexual health and reproductive rights, the autonomous right of the child to decide their gender, their orientation, and their behavior. The goal is to reduce risk. So we teach consent, how to use condoms, teach kids to be aware of emergency contraception, abortion, and to get themselves tested frequently, to be aware of non-reproductive sexual behavior such as anal, oral sex, masturbation, and cybersex. And yes, they do mention abstaining from sex, but it tends to be a very minuscule component of the program. Comprehensive sex ed focuses on developing healthy relationships. They emphasize gender identity and experiment with sexual orientation. Talk about sexual expression and behaviors, sexual behaviors. They teach about communicating consent, negotiating sexual relations, and the importance of mutual satisfaction. Comprehensive sex ed basically says that sex with a condom is equally responsible to abstaining from all sexual activity. What does this look like in our Ontario curriculum? I'm focusing on the Ontario curriculum, but this applies across Canada and most of the United States. In grade 1, we teach the kids about the genitalia. We get them to label genitalia in the classroom. I don't have a problem with kids knowing what a penis is, but I do have concern with kids labeling genitalia in the classroom in mixed groups, and also some classrooms even have plush toy genitalia where, the genitalia slides inside and out of one another. And I've asked teachers, as I've spoken across Canada, what's been the impact in the school? And I've heard from teachers that it's led to increased investigation on the playground, reduced modesty. And in grades 2 and 3, children are taught about the visible and invisible differences in people, which is a platform for teaching about sexual orientation and gender identity. If you'd like to have a look at what does this look like in the classroom in the early grades, please have a look at this CBN news report. The link for that report will be below the video. Then by the time we get to grades 5 and 6, we're supposed to be building sexuality confidence in the comprehensive sex ed curriculum. And the curriculum says this is done through teaching about masturbation and the skills of consent for sexual activity and how to end a relationship. Why are we teaching them how to end a relationship? Well, because if you're going to start having sexual relationships early, you're going to have multiple relationships. You're going to have relationships that end, and they say it's important that we need to teach our kids how to end the relationship amicably. We sit here and wonder, wouldn't it be better to ask the question, what would be the characteristics you would want in the person that you would want to spend the rest of your life with? But anyway, then by grade 7, we need to teach them about the ways to show affection. Holding hands, anal sex, oral sex, intercourse, self and mutual masturbation. By this time, abstinence is redefined. It's no longer abstaining from all sexual activity. It's a personal decision. You're definition of abstinence is based upon the sexual activities that you do not want to participate in. Grade 7, we're talking about mutually satisfying relationships, sexting, how to communicate and negotiate consent, and confidence with contraceptives. Much of the resources are often criticized for being pornographic, and based upon the legal definitions of pornography and child pornography, they do qualify. And many parents are complaining, but our school boards are saying, no, this is not pornography, it's educational materials. So what has been the impact of comprehensive sex education? Has it achieved its goal of reducing pregnancy, reducing STIs, improving health? Well, teen birth rates in Canada and the US have gone down, but the research can't determine why. Is it because of the comprehensive sex ed programs? Has it been because students have shifted towards non-reproductive sexual activity? Is it because of increased condom use, increased abortion? Is it because students now can access over-the-counter emergency contraceptives at any time without a prescription? We don't really know why. So let's look at the STI rates. Has comprehensive sex ed led to improved health by reducing STI rates? Well, the research shows that since 1997, when we started implementing comprehensive sex ed in our schools, the chlamydia rate, now the chlamydia is the most commonly reported sexually transmitted infection. And the chlamydia rates nationally have gone up slightly. But for 15-year-olds and 20 to 24-year-olds, it's gone up extremely quickly. This is an indication to us that teen sexual activity may not have decreased, but the sexual activity may have shifted to other sexual activity that still does transmit STIs. Has comprehensive sex education worked? Well, this study was released in 2019 by the Institute for Research and Evaluation, and it looked at all of the comprehensive sex ed research, 103 studies. So comprehensive sex ed had been in place since 1997. So from 2000 to 2015, everybody's watching. Is it doing what it's promised to do? And this study shows that no. As a matter of fact, of the 103 studies, only 6 showed some improvement. Much more showed negative effect. And there was no evidence at all of increased condom use. The conclusion was comprehensive sex ed is ineffective, not just in the United States, but in all areas where it's being implemented. But they said sexual risk avoidance looks promising. So let's go back to our timeline. So comprehensive sex ed between about 2000 and the early 2020s, right? Teen pregnancies going down, but we're not sure why. Teen STI rates and depression and other negative consequences are going up. So comprehensive sex ed is being criticized. So instead of saying we're going to make adjustments to improve our program to lead to better health, comprehensive sex ed advocates like Planned Parenthood said, we're going to change our rationale for comprehensive sex education. They came up with a new rationale and a new ideology, and that is sex ed is a vehicle for social change, full stop. No, it's not for improving health, it's for social change. And in their publications, and they report, while sex education is a necessary sexual health tool, it can and should be much more than that. With sex education, we have a golden opportunity to teach today's culture about sexual and reproductive rights. Again, what's happening? They're emphasizing reproductive rights, which include 5 areas: reproductive justice, LGBTQ equality, sexual violence prevention, and we're all in favor of that, gender equity, and yes, dismantling white supremacy. In January of 2024, the new benchmarks, Canadian benchmarks for effective comprehensive sexual health education were released by CSA. Those benchmarks, the summary statements are 96% of the participants, and how they decided on what the benchmarks would be was they sent out a survey of all of the different things that could be taught. And they sent it out to 267 people that were somewhat involved in sexual health education. And they asked them to decide, when should we be teaching consent? When should, from kindergarten to grade 12? When should we be teaching about STIs? When should we be teaching about condoms? And they checked off their results, okay, their opinions, all right? And 96% of the participants agreed that access to age-appropriate sexual health education is a basic human right. Coming back to that again. And comprehensive sexual health education should begin early and include a variety of relevant topics. As a matter of fact, they are recommending that consent for sexual activity should begin in kindergarten. The third point, sexual health education should be inclusive, evidence-based, aim to reduce homophobia and transphobia and promote gender equality and the right to autonomous decision-making. In other words, students have the right to choose, undermining the input of families. So, comprehensive sex ed is not working. So, what's happened? Well, there's become much more interest in sexual risk avoidance. And the sexual risk avoidance groups, they have been developing effective curriculum and implementing that curriculum. So, let's look a little bit at sexual risk avoidance. What are the key topics? Well, most sexual risk avoidance programs include identifying personal goals and values. What is important to you? What do you believe? What's the negative impact of non-marital sex on your goals? How does sexual activity, how does that negatively influence achieving those goals? What are the benefits of avoiding non-marital sex? What is the purpose of sex? Healthy versus unhealthy relationships. And Pastor Dave went through that in session number 8, and how to protect your future by establishing boundaries, avoiding tempting circumstances, and developing refusal skills. So that's an overview of the sexual risk avoidance programs. Does it work? Well, Ascend has 25 peer-reviewed studies that show that students that take SRA classes are more likely to delay sexual activity, and if they have been sexually active, they're more likely to discontinue or decrease their sexual activity. Does it work? We have a program that we use called Heritage Keepers, and it's been tested by Mathematica in large school studies. And the results show us that 12 months after the program, the students in the study and the well-matched control peer groups are surveyed. And the program students have initiated sex at a rate of 67% lower than non-program students. So yes, sexual risk avoidance does work. Let's do a comparison now of comprehensive sex ed and sexual risk avoidance. We looked at the premise for comprehensive sex ed, and we've also talked about the premise for sexual risk avoidance. So let's move on from there. Comprehensive sex ed, it focuses on reducing risk, talking about safer sex. Whereas sexual risk avoidance, the focus is on avoiding risks and keeping students safe. Comprehensive sex ed has a dual message. It says, yes, you can choose abstinence, but if you remember, abstinence means different things to different people. Or you can choose consensual sexual activity with contraception. Sexual risk avoidance has a very direct message. It guides students to choose abstinence, delaying all sexual activity until a long-term, mutually monogamous relationship, ideally marriage. Comprehensive sex ed is a rights-based, pleasure-based approach. Sexual risk avoidance is a science-based, health-based approach. Comprehensive sex education advocates for contraception, emphasizing the effectiveness and minimizing the ineffectiveness. Sexual risk avoidance educates about contraception, both the effectiveness and the ineffectiveness or the risks. Comprehensive sex ed teaches consent and negotiation skills for sexual activity, whereas SRA teaches refusal and resistance skills for sexual risk avoidance. Comprehensive sex ed tells kids that sexually transmitted infections are normal, it's common, whereas sexual risk avoidance talks about STIs or sexually transmitted diseases can cause serious health concerns and should and can be avoided. Comprehensive sex education has instruction segmented for students of different sexual orientations and gender identity. Whereas sexual risk avoidance, the information provided and the risk avoidance promoted is for all students, regardless of their sexual orientation and their gender identity. In comprehensive sex ed, abortion is presented as a safe, reproductive healthcare choice. Sexual risk avoidance, abortion, if it's discussed, is presented with the state laws or the provincial laws, the physical and emotional risks, emphasizing parenting and adoption. Under comprehensive sex ed, parental relationship, knowledge, and relevancy is undermined. Students are encouraged to seek other help, whereas in sexual risk avoidance, we encourage parental involvement, communication, and authority is upheld. So, what's the goal of sexual risk avoidance? The goal is to empower youth to protect their futures by avoiding non-marital sex. And this reduces teen pregnancy, reduces STIs, leads to improved mental health, improved families, improved communities, and improved nations. So now you have a question to answer. Which approach best fits the needs of your child? Comprehensive sex ed or sexual risk avoidance? Homework is, you need to decide. Try to decide on the approach for your family. Guide your child. Get some resources to begin discussion. And we've covered some of those resources in these 10 sessions. One of those really good resources is God's Design for Sex series. Watch one of the videos in this series with your child and have a discussion. Build connectedness with your child, plan a fun activity, and do it together. Thank you so much for watching session 9. We look forward to seeing you in session 10 on advocacy. Now that you're working to bring your children along towards the sexual risk avoidance approach, how can we advocate for this approach with other families, and in our community? We'll see you in session 10.